I am your host, Robert Rowe, and you are listening to Awake Radio. Today is April 22nd, 2013. In the news today, Michael Bloomberg, the Democrat mayor of New York City, has called for a reinterpretation of the U.S. Constitution under the auspices of creating greater safety and preventing further attacks similar to the Boston bombings. At a press conference in Midtown, Mayor Bloomberg stated, "The people who are worried about privacy have a legitimate worry. But we live in a complex world where you're going to have a level of security greater than you did back in the olden days, if you will. And our laws and our interpretation of the Constitution, I think, have to change." He continues, "Look, we live in a very dangerous world. We know there are people who want to take away our freedoms. New Yorkers probably know this as much, if not more, than anybody else after the terrible tragedies of 9/11. He further states, "We have to understand that in the world going forward, we are going to have more cameras and stuff like that. That's good in some sense, but it's different from what we are used to. Clearly, the U.S. Supreme Court has recognized that you have to have different interpretations of the Second Amendment and what it applies to and reasonable gun laws." Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., U.S. Senator Frank R. Lautenberg, the Democrat from New Jersey, announced his intention to reintroduce to Congress legislation which, if passed, would require background checks for the purchase of any kind of explosive powder. Current law allows for the purchase of up to 50 pounds of black powder and unlimited quantities of smokeless powder and black powder substitute without a background check. Lautenberg rages in his press release, "It is outrageous that anyone, even a known terrorist, can walk into a store in America and buy explosives without any questions asked. If we are serious about public safety, we must put these common sense safeguards in place. While the police have not revealed what specific explosive material was used in Boston, what we do know is that explosive powder is too easy to anonymously purchase across the country." The bill Lautenberg intends to introduce, entitled Explosive Materials Background Check Act, will require a background check to purchase any black powder substitute, smokeless powder, or any other explosive in any quantity. Will provide the Attorney General with the authority to stop the sale of explosives when a background check reveals that the applicant is a known or suspected terrorist and the Attorney General reasonably believes that the person may use the explosives in connection with terrorism, and make it illegal to manufacture homemade explosives without a permit. A similar proposal was introduced by Lautenberg in 2003 as his failed Homeland Security Gun Safety Act of 2003. Here is my opinion for the one or two of you who may care. Those are the facts of events playing out in the year 2013. This year, the United States will turn 237 years old. Now, in the grand scheme of empire longevity, the United States is still little more than a toddler. Unfortunately, it seems that the most powerful empire the world has ever seen is doomed to be considered by future historians as a flash-in-the-pan empire. Quickly rising to prominence and just as quickly extinguished, the United States is unlikely to enjoy the prestige of the longtime world dominance empires like Rome and England. This is because in the brief and eventful history of the United States, we have managed to forget the lessons we learned in the 1700s. Today, we are again living through the same sufferance of our founding fathers with one major difference. Where they were keen to the abuses of the crown, Americans of today are at best apathetic toward the abuses of their government. Today we are facing nefarious plans to disarm our citizens. The Second Amendment of our Constitution is undergoing a never-ending attack by those who would enslave our people. Mayor Bloomberg's call to reinterpret the Constitution and Senator Lautenberg's attempt to place backdoor limits on the people's ability to purchase explosive powders, which are necessary for the independent manufacture of ammunition, are merely the latest in a long string of attempts by the enemies of liberty to abolish our inalienable right to self-protection from criminals and self-protection from the government. While the revolution proper did not begin until April 1775, there were several events which happened in 1774 that led up to it. David B. Kopel, research director of the Independence Institute and adjunct professor of advanced constitutional law, Denver University Sturm College of Law, cites these abuses of power in 1774 as providing the insight to the scope of the modern-day Second Amendment. In his article, How British Gun Control Program Precipitated the American Revolution, that's a mouthful, Mr. Kopel very succinctly and plainly defines how American gun culture and attitude towards tyranny spurred them to action and eventually led to their taking action against the British Crown. Now, from here on out, I'm going to read to you excerpts from his article with a little bit of commentary, as Mr. Kopel makes the case much better than I ever could. He starts out, furious at the December 1773 Boston Tea Party, Parliament in 1774 passed the Coercive Acts. The particular provisions of the Coercive Acts were offensive to Americans, but it was the possibility that the British might deploy the army to enforce them that primed many colonists for armed resistance. The Patriots of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania resolved, quote, that in the event of Great Britain attempting to force unjust laws upon us by the strength of arms, our cause we leave to heaven and our rifles, end of quote. A South Carolina newspaper essay, reprinted in Virginia, urged that any law that had to be enforced by the military was necessarily illegitimate. Today, America faces the same prospect of our own military being used against us to enforce illegal and unjust laws with regard to gun control measures. The National Defense Authorization Act gives authority to the President to order our regular military to conduct warrantless searches or to seize anything deemed by the President to be illegal. It merely has to be determined by the President that firearms of any sort are illegal, and the military may then kick down your door and confiscate those firearms by force if necessary. Think it can't be done? Consider Hurricane Katrina. National Guard units were deployed to the stricken area where they conducted house-to-house searches and confiscated any firearm they found. More recently, after the Boston bombing incident, the military was again used to conduct house-to-house searches without warrants. The worst part of this is that nobody objected. They placidly went along with the process as if they didn't have any say in the matter. Disgusting. To continue with Kopel's article, the Royal Governor of Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, had forbidden town meetings from taking place more than once a year. When he dispatched the Redcoats to break up an illegal town meeting in Salem, 3,000 armed Americans appeared in response, and the British retreated. Gage's aide, John Andrews, explained that everyone in the area aged 16 or older owned a gun and plenty of gunpowder. Comparing to today, in order to exercise our right to freely and peaceably assemble, we must first obtain a permit granting us permission to exercise our inalienable right. If we are graciously granted that permission by the governmental body overseeing permit applications, we are permitted to conduct that assembly only in areas that are labeled free speech zones. If there is any person in the vicinity who is under the protection of the Secret Service, the assembly is no longer permitted under current law. Copel continues, military rule would be difficult to impose on an armed populace. Gage had only 2,000 troops in Boston, and there were thousands of armed men in Boston alone and more in the surrounding area. One response to the problem was to deprive Americans of gunpowder. Now, under the bill proposed by Senator Lautenberg, law-abiding citizens would be required to undergo a background check before being allowed to purchase any type of explosive powder. Further, limits on the quantity of powder will also be placed, again, on the law-abiding citizen. As with background checks for firearm purchases, these will pose no more than a slight bump in the road for persons wishing to purchase these items illegally. Back to Mr. Copel. Modern smokeless gunpowder is stable under most conditions. The black powder of the 18th century was far more volatile. Accordingly, large quantities of black powder were often stored in a town's powder house, typically a reinforced brick building. The powder house would hold merchants' reserves, large quantities stored by individuals, as well as powder for use by the local militia. Although colonial laws generally required militiamen, and sometimes all householders too, to have their own firearm and a minimum quantity of powder, not everyone could afford it. Consequently, the government sometimes supplied public arms and powder to individual militiamen. Policies varied on whether militiamen who had been given the public arms could keep them at home. Public arms would often be stored in a special armory, which might also be the powder house. Before dawn, on September 1st, 1774, 260 of Gage's redcoats sailed up the Mystic River and seized hundreds of barrels of powder from the Charleston powder house. The powder alarm, as it became known, was a serious provocation. By the end of that day, 20,000 militiamen had mobilized and started marching towards Boston. In Connecticut and western Massachusetts, rumors quickly spread that the powder alarm had actually involved fighting in the streets of Boston. More accurate reports reached the militia companies before the militia reached Boston, so the war did not begin in September of 1774. The message, though, was unmistakable. If the British used violence to seize arms or powder, the Americans would treat that violent seizure as an act of war and would fight. And that is exactly what happened several months later on April 19, 1775. 5 days after the powder alarm, on September 6, the militia in the towns of Worcester County assembled in the Worcester Common. Backed by the formidable array, the Worcester Convention took over the reins of government and ordered the resignation of all militia officers who had received their commissions from the royal governor. The officers promptly resigned and then received new commissions from the Worcester Convention. The First Continental Congress, which had just been assembled in Philadelphia, unanimously endorsed the Suffolk Resolve and urged all the other colonies to send supplies to help the Bostonians. Governor Gage directed the Redcoats to begin general warrantless searches for arms and ammunition. According to the Boston Gazette, all of Gage's offenses, what most irritated the people was the seizing of arms and ammunition. When the Massachusetts Assembly convened, General Gage declared it illegal. So the representatives reassembled as the Provincial Congress. On October 26, 1774, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress adopted a resolution condemning military rule and criticizing Gage for unlawfully seizing and retaining large quantities of ammunition in the arsenal at Boston. The Provincial Congress urged all militia companies to organize and elect their own officers. At least a quarter of the militia, our famous Minutemen, were directed to equip and hold themselves in readiness to march at the shortest notice. The Provincial Congress further declared that everyone who did not already have a gun should get one and start practicing with it diligently. In flagrant defiance of royal authority, the Provincial Congress appointed a committee of safety and vested it with the power to call forth the militia. The militia of Massachusetts was now the instrument of what was becoming an independent government of Massachusetts. Lord Dartmouth, The Royal Secretary of State for America sent Gage a letter on October 17, 1774, urging him to disarm New England. Gage replied that he would like to, but it was impossible without the use of force. After Gage's letter was made public by a reading in the British House of Commons, it was publicized in America as proof of Britain's malign intentions. In spite of recent victory for liberty in the Senate, where gun control measures to require expanded background checks was defeated, the Congress has a long history of passing laws designed to limit or eliminate certain freedoms enjoyed by the American people. When they fail to pass these restricting laws, the current president has taken it upon himself to abuse his executive order privileges to bypass Congress altogether. As in the case with General Gage's letter, this abuse of executive orders shows the government's malign intentions. Make no mistake about it, these executive orders are illegal and will be struck down by the Supreme Court if they are still a just and constitutional court. If they fail to strike down these executive orders, we will know that all three branches of the government have become absolutely corrupted and are no longer legitimate. Back to the article. 2 days after Lord Dartmouth dispatched his disarmament recommendation, King George III and his ministers blocked importation of arms and ammunition to America. Read literally, the order merely required a permit to export arms or ammunition from Great Britain to America. In practice, no permits were granted. Today, in many states, one must obtain a permit in order to be eligible to purchase a firearm of any sort. Some of these states are very reluctant to issue permits, and others do not issue at all. Back in 1774, Benjamin Franklin was masterminding the surreptitious import of arms and ammunition from the Netherlands, France, and Spain. Here in the United States in 2013, we see that some states that have adopted restrictive gun control laws, like New York and Colorado, firearm manufacturers are refusing to sell their products to those states and or are moving their manufacturing plants to states with friendly firearm environments. Back in 1774, the patriotic Boston Committee of Correspondence learned of the arms embargo and promptly dispatched Paul Revere to New Hampshire with the warning that 2 British ships were headed to Fort William and Mary near Portsmouth, near New Hampshire, to seize firearms, cannons, and gunpowder. On December 14, 1774, 400 New Hampshire patriots preemptively captured all the material at the fort. A New Hampshire newspaper argued that the capture was prudent and proper, reminding the readers that the ancient Carthaginians had consented to deliver up their arms to the Romans and were decimated by the Romans soon after. In Parliament, a moderate minority favored conciliation with America. Among the moderates was the Duke of Manchester, who warned that America now had 3 million people, and most of them were trained to use arms. He was certain they could produce a stronger army than Great Britain. Today in the United States, there are currently over 300 million guns in circulations, owned by approximately 100 million civilians. This makes the American people the largest standing army in the world. Even with their drones, tanks, and fighter aircraft, the American military cannot defeat an army of 100 million. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress offered to purchase as many arms and bayonets as could be delivered to the next session of the Congress. Massachusetts also urged American gunsmiths diligently to apply themselves to making guns for everyone who did not already have a gun. A few weeks earlier, the Congress had resolved that it be strongly recommended to all the inhabitants of this colony to be diligently attentive to learning the use of arms. Derived from political and legal philosophers such as John Locke, Hugo Grotius, and Edward Coke, the ideology underlying all forms of American resistance was explicitly premised on the right of self-defense of all inalienable rights. From the self-defense foundation was constructed a political theory in which people were the masters and government the servant, so that the people have the right to remove a disobedient servant. Now, the British government was not in a purely formal sense, attempting to abolish the Americans' common law right of self-defense. Yet in practice, that was precisely what the British were attempting. First, by disarming the Americans, the British were attempting to make the practical exercise of the right of personal self-defense much more difficult. Second, and more fundamentally, the Americans made no distinction between self-defense against a lone criminal or against a criminal government. To the Americans and to their British Whig ancestors, the right of self-defense necessarily implied the right of armed self-defense against tyranny. Most Americans hold this to be just as true today as they did in 1774. The difference with the Americans of today, they are only willing to hold to this truth as long as it does not interfere with their regularly scheduled viewing of American Idol. The American War of Independence began on April 19, 1775, when 700 redcoats under the command of Major John Pitcairn left Boston to seize American arms at Lexington and Concord. To the Americans of the Revolution and the founding era, the theory of some late 20th century courts that the Second Amendment is a collective right and not an individual right might have seemed incomprehensible. The Americans owned guns individually in their homes. They owned guns collectively in their town armories and powder houses. They would not allow the British to confiscate their individual arms nor their collective arms, and when the British tried to do both, the Revolution began. The Americans used their individual arms and their collective arms to fight against the confiscation of any arms. Americans fought to provide themselves a government that would never perpetuate the abuses that had provoked the Revolution. The most important lesson for today from the Revolution is about militaristic or violent search and seizure in the name of disarmament. Something the government of the United States would do well to remember if they are not interested in history repeating itself in our country any more than it already has with regard to firearm restrictions and confiscations. I'm Robert Rowe. I hope you've enjoyed today's show. If you have any questions or comments on today's show, or if you have suggestions for future shows, you can email me at rrowe@awarenessact.com. That's RROWE@awarenessact.com. You can also post a message on my Awareness Act wall, or you can leave me a private message and I will respond to you as quickly as possible. I hope you have a great day.